Hello and welcome to this YD simulated lecture, the Studio 17 movement, Lykkeland and ideas of change in the 2010s. My name is Hultin and I'm an artist and a researcher here at the Fremtiden University. And this lecture is the first one in a series of lectures focusing on the rise and work of groups like the Studio 17 movement and how these organizations acted more than 100 years ago revolutionized ideas of change. This lecture will not go so much into detail about the Studio 17 movement, but will rather explain the background to it. And before we start, I want to take the opportunity to thank our very skilled YD programmers here at the Fremtiden University who have made this simulation, letting us see and experience Rogaland kunstsenter in 2019, a place that of course would be of great importance for this movement. So this is how it looked like a little more than 100 years ago in 2019, a little before the movement started in the summer of 2019. But to understand ideas of change and in the 2010s and why movements like the Studio 17 movement started at this place at this particular time in history, we have to look back at Norway and the world at this time. Because 2019 was a unique time both for Norway and for the rest of the world. With globalization, people's relatively new access to the internet, an escalating climate crisis and increased migration, the world was in the midst of a number of major changes. Powered by a growing extreme right, Jair Bolsonaro had just won the presidential election in Brazil, just like Donald Trump had in the US 3 years earlier. In Norway, the right-wing populist party Fremtiden had become the third largest party, pushing a xenophobic, climate-denying and neoliberal agenda. At this time, the most catastrophic consequences of climate change had yet not been seen, even if research showed that life on Earth was under threat due to global warming, that this was caused by the use of fossil fuels such as oil, coal and gas. Sufficient action was not taken. At this time, several leaders from the far right, like Bolsonaro, Trump or Åkesson in Sweden, even denied that climate change was caused by humans. In Norway, Fremskrittspartiet was an important force regarding this, with their representative Kjell-Børge Freiberg as Minister of Petroleum and Energy. So even if serious research about the connection between carbon emissions and global warming had been known and scientifically proven since the 1970s, climate skepticism and even denial was increasing during the beginning of the 2000s. And Norway was actually was one of the countries with highest level of climate denial and skepticism among its population, which is of course very interesting because Norway at this time was a highly educated country with one of the highest living standards in the world. So how how was this possible? Based on his research on climate denial in Norway, Swedish Associate Professor Martin Hultin could distinguish two groups that stood out as particularly active in their denial. The first group were older, highly educated, white male scientists or executives that were in different ways connected to the extractive industries. If you looked on who were in the board of Klimatrealisterna, for example, and this was a lobby group that spread climate denial propaganda, most of them were or had been making money on the extractive industry in some way. So this was the first group. The other group consisted of xenophobic or racist white men in all ages, from all classes, from the workers at the oil platforms in the North Sea to industry executives. An American study from 2011 presented two major causes for climate denial among conservative and racist white men in the US. The first one was simply that conservative men, in a greater extent than others, benefited from the current capitalist industrial order that provided them with disproportionate amounts of power and financial benefits. The other cause has to do with something called identity protective cognition, a term describing how people tend to adopt beliefs shared by influential people they identify with, so-called in-groups. These beliefs are also very hard to change, especially if they are challenged by people that they don't identify with, a so-called out-group. So the resistance to scientific findings could be a form of self-defense and protection of the self-esteem that individuals experience from group membership. So the facts presented by leading climate scientists threatened both these groups' identity and also the system that they had benefited from. So these two groups stood out in the statistics regarding climate denial. But if you looked at this in a bigger perspective, you could see that although these groups were an important force in spreading climate denial propaganda, they did not do it in a vacuum. The nations in the rich West, like Norway, Sweden, the US, France, etc., even if their governments believed in the facts presented by climate scientists, behaved as they didn't. And the truth is, Norway as a nation, but also its citizens, simply benefited too much from the excavation industry to want to change. At the same time, in the early 2000s, social justice and environmental movements were growing faster all around the world. Different indigenous groups, for example, like the Sami, were through the internet now able to work together even more efficient in order to claim the right to their land and to demand redress for the crimes committed by the majority society. People who broke norms regarding gender and sexuality and people of color had also begun to organize themselves globally. For a lot of social justice and environmental movements, these things that I mentioned before, globalization, migration, and access to the internet and technology, led to new opportunities for organizing, to be inspired by, and to find support in each other's struggles. But for many belonging to groups or nations that had benefited the privileges that had been made possible through colonization, exploitation of natural resources, slavery, controlling people's gender identity, language, and religion, the marginalized groups increased mobility and criticism of the majority society's oppression was threatening. Because this new world and uncertain future challenged privileges that had been taken for granted. The only solution for many was a movement back in time to what felt like a safer and better past. In the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's last book from 2017, the author described people of this time's difficulty to cope with an increasingly complex world characterized by globalization and natural disasters, and how one longed to return to what was thought to be a safer and simpler past, a retrotopia. And this was visible in popular culture and design of the time, but also in politics. Ultra-nationalist parties were winning votes by claiming that their countries were under attack, that safety was threatened by immigrants. Fremtid's answer to this was a story about a better Norway before immigration, while, of course, Trump promised white voters to make America great again. ICPP's special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius came out in October 2018. The report, summarizing over data from more than 6,000 environmental scientists all around the world, concluded that to stop a total climate collapse, global warming had to stop at 1.5 degrees at most. This meant that the emission of greenhouse gases had to be lowered by 50% in the coming years, and that the excavation of fossil fuels had to be stopped immediately. This report was a part of the Paris Agreement that Norway was one of the first countries to sign in 2015. The same year that the Norwegian state handed out rights to 13 companies to drill for oil in the Arctic. So despite the scientists' discussion by describing Norwegian excavation as climate friendly, in that it didn't use as much fossil fuels as other countries, even though that wasn't the real problem, this fact, and also the fact that, for example, Norway had the most electric cars per capita, was used as a counter-argument to the environmental movement. And it was true that almost all energy used in Norway came from hydropower plants. The excavated oil, gas and coal was exported to other countries, along with the responsibility, of course. The same month as ICPP's report, special report was released, NRK, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, started to air Lykkeland, State of Happiness, a nostalgic saga telling the story of the beginning of the Norwegian oil industry right here in Stavanger. In the center of the story is a young man who, despite his parents not believing in him, takes on a career as a diver on the oil rigs. His fiancée, who, undeterred by a poor rural background, builds a career in the city, and another young man who, despite his American boss not believing in him, decides to take on the adventure to drill for oil in the North Sea. This is not a story about how the excavation of oil and gas was threatening life on Earth, or how Norway became one of the richest countries because of it. It's a story of a great adventure, of how a few brave people became successful by believing in themselves, and of the good old times. Around this time, researcher and activist Tobias Hübinette also coined the term white melancholia to describe a longing back shared by both white racists and white self-proclaimed anti-racists, while organizations like Fremtiden for example, fantasized about a Norway before globalization and immigration, many other Norwegians fantasized about a time when the idea of an equal, good and righteous West was stronger. And both of these ideas were, of course, just ideas, but were perhaps easier to believe when your privileges weren't questioned. But with the rise of social justice and environmental movements during the 20th and 21st century, the self-image of the privilege was indeed questioned. If one were afraid that marginalized groups would gain more power and that one's privileges would disappear, that so many things would change and become unfamiliar, perhaps it wasn't so strange to be tempted by Trump's promise to make America great again, or Bolsonaro's and Siv Jensen's promise to make Brazil and Norway safer at any cost. So now we have moved past the first part of this lecture, and before we continue, we will make a short meditation exercise. So make sure that you sit comfortably. You can also, if you want to lie down on the floor or something, that's also okay, but it's important that you're quite comfortable, okay? And close your eyes, and we will sit like this for like 5 minutes, just so you know. And focus on your body and how it feels right now. Now feel your breath coming in through your nostrils, filling up your chest and stomach, traveling out through your chest and nose again. Feel the soles of your feet resting against the floor. Feel your calves, your relaxed knees. Feel your thighs, your ass resting on the chair or on the floor. Let your belly rest while it fills up with air. Feel your chest, your shoulders, your upper arms, your forearms, hands, all the way out to your fingertips. Feel your neck, your jaw, your forehead, and your scalp on the top of your head. Take a few deep breaths and imagine that it's not only your lungs breathing, but your whole body at the same time. Now think about change and about how it's happening everywhere all the time. Think about the orbits of the planets of our solar system changing, the temperatures on Earth, the seasons, summer to fall to winter to spring, the water traveling in currents all around our planet, melting, raining, rushing through a green landscape, watering a plant growing in the soil. Imagine yourself eating that plant and that plant becoming part of you. Think about the cells in your body changing, your skin aging and falling off piece by piece, quickly replaced by new skin cells, your hair and nails growing. Think about the cells in your mucous membranes that are the cells that changes the fastest. Some of them only take minutes to replace. For others it takes longer. The cells in your sternum takes 15 years to replace. For a long time, scientists believed that the cells of the heart never changed, but newer research showed that they do. It just goes very, very slow. The heart of a 20-year-old replaces 1% of its cells each year. For a 75-year-old heart, that process takes 2 times longer. This means that the heart, when it stops beating, is a mix between cells that you carried since you were born and newer ones that you gained throughout your life. Think about how your mind is changing. With every experience, with every new encounter, with every second of time passing, it's changing. Now think about the change that you're faced with in your life right now. It can be a relationship or something in you that is about to change. Perhaps something quite scary that you know is coming, that you may have been holding on to for a while now. Now imagine taking a small step in the direction of that change. It might involve making a call, talking to a friend, writing a letter, contacting someone that you don't know yet. Now imagine that everyone in this room supports you in daring to do this scary, scary thing. Whether it's holding on to something or letting go of someone, they support you 100%. Imagine some of these people sitting or standing beside you, holding their hands on your shoulder, letting you know that they're on your side. Everyone in this room right now is supporting you. Now imagine that you're doing the same for everyone else in this room. Someone here needs support in talking to their friend, co-worker, or brother. Someone needs to break up with their partner. Someone needs to stand up to their boss. Imagine giving them your support by holding an imaginary hand on their shoulder. Now you can take a deep breath, and as you exhale, you can open your eyes again. So, as I explained before the exercise, many people in Norway and the rest of the rich West long for an idea of a safer, simpler past. But, and this is perhaps more interesting for this lecture, who was not nostalgic about the past? Could a story be told that seemed more true, righteous and appealing than the stories told by Bolsonaro, Trump, Jensen and the rest of the far-right wing? Instead of looking back, who chose or who did not have the choice but to look forward? In the book Starboard Wine from 1984, the science fiction writer, professor and critic Samuel R. Delany stated that science fiction is in fact not about the future, but rather the potential of the present. In an interview from 1994, he explained Black Americans' need to create images of the future as a reaction to slavery's systematic destruction of their African history. Delany was often described as belonging to the aesthetic and philosophical genre of Afrofuturism that critiqued the norm of whiteness. Mark Deary, who coined the term, defined it as African American voices with other stories to tell about culture, technology, and what is to come. This idea of exploring the potential of the present was something that several writers, artists, scientists, and activists, coming from different marginalized groups and fighting for social justice, were occupied with in the beginning of the 21st century. Still fighting for basic human rights, the past was not. The main character, Lauren, understands that she must find a way to relate to this new world, where her father's Christian religion no longer makes sense, as it is not adapted to what is happening. She designs the philosophy or religion Earthseed, based on the only thing she sees as constant: change. A central book in the fictional book The Books of the Living reads: consider whether you're a human being, an insect, a microbe, a stone, or a stone. This verse is true. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. So Lauren, the main character, has no choice but to adapt to what is happening in order to survive. And she also understands that since change is the only thing that is constant, that it's something to respect and at times even revere. The religion is not claiming that change is either good or bad, but that it's something that one has to relate to in order to be part of shaping the future, shaping God. As a side note, I can add that in the second book of the series, Parable of the Talents, published in 1998, mind you, the group is threatened by the rise of a new political leader, Senator Andrew Steele Jarrett, who's aiming for the presidency with the promise and slogan to make America great again. The futurist, lawyer and entrepreneur Martin Rothblatt founded the TerraSem Foundation, inspired by the Earthseed religion of Butler's book in 2002. In an interview with New York Magazine, they explained that they use a gender-neutral pronoun and that they like to use the prefix trans because it, quote, confirmed their self-image as an explorer who crosses borders to new unexplored places. They saw themselves not as much a trans person as a transhumanist, a particular kind of futurist who believes that technology can free people from their biological constraints. The TerraSem Foundation's main project was to investigate how an analog consciousness could be created by compiling detailed data about the person and then downloaded to either a biological or nanotechnical body, or as people of the time called it, a robot. Ideas similar to Rothblatt's and Butler's can be found in numerous plays, novels, poems, dance pieces, and artworks from this time. One example is the Brazilian science fiction movie Janaina Overdrive from 2016, which was actually restored from a hard drive found by archaeological divers in the former city centre of Stavanger only about a year ago. In the film, the transgender cyborg sex worker finds out that she will be updated to a newer version and thus has to find an illegal terminal where she can upload her consciousness to access a virtual reality. At this time, in 2019, these ideas seemed too utopian for most people. But from today's perspective, it's of course easy to see how thinking ahead the times people like Butler and Rothblatt has been for today's AI, gender, climate and space research. So in the late 2010s, as heavy forces in the form of populist, right-wing, climate-denying political parties, companies and corrupted world leaders occupying backward stances, there were also networks, often organizing at a grassroots level within marginalized groups who represented other approaches. Activists, artists, writers and thinkers who fought for equal rights and for the environment, who wanted to address and reflect the complexity of people and society, and who dared, or in many cases had no choice but to look forward and to cooperate to make their voices heard. In Norway, there were groups and initiatives such as Natur og Ungdom, Tjejvärlden, LOs Bjartnum, Salam and Greenpeace, who with the help of the internet began to share strategies and ideas by building new activist networks to facilitate them working together. And this is where Studio 17 and Rogaland kunstsenter comes in. in the summer of 2019, the still sort of loose network that would later be named after this place didn't have any physical home, but would rather meet up in different forums online. But then when some people who were regulars at Studio 17 wanted to arrange a larger meeting for local activists, they asked the municipality to borrow a space with the ambition to, as they said, organize free screenings of Lykkeland to integrate Stavanger's immigrant communities, which of course they didn't. But that's actually how the movement got its first space, completely free of charge. And from June 2019, the meetings were held in this very room. And of course, this was not easy. There were numerous fights and arguments, especially in the beginning. People with significantly different experiences and backgrounds who tried to collaborate often had a very hard time to come to a similar conclusion. And there's actually an extensive amount of protocols and notes from this time displaying several examples of this. But the interesting thing is that despite these arguments, they insisted that this meeting and talking and listening to each other, to be able to collaborate and to be open to change and to differences, was the only way forward. And Zygmunt Bauman uses his last chapter in Retrotopia to discuss alternatives to the retrograde and destructive movements of this time. And his simple and also yet super difficult and complex answer to the question of how humankind can build a peaceful and equal society is dialogue, the art of talking and listening. And the last sentence in Retrotopia reads, more than at any time, we, human inhabitants of the earth, are in the either-or situation. We face joining either hands or common graves. And now this lecture is over, but if you're more interested in learning more about the Studio 17 movement, you're more than welcome to join me in my next lecture, which will be held in 2 months, so in June 21 and 19. Thank you so much for coming and listening.